Hello, everyone. Welcome to Sitheads Meditation Club. My name is John. I organize this group, and Sitheads is a sitting and social group for people interested in deep meditation practice. Everything we do is free and donation-based, and if you want to hang out with us, you can find us at sit-heads.com. So I would like to, it is frankly my absolute pleasure and privilege to introduce our guest for the evening, who I will bring up in just a moment, Deborah Helzer. Deborah has been meditating for 30 years, including a year spent as a nun in Burma with the great 20th century Vipassana master Sayadaw U Pandita. She is a sort of traditional exponent of the Mahasi-style of Vipassana practice, but approaches it with a subtlety and nuance that I found incredibly helpful, and a broad-mindedness and thoughtfulness, without at all straying from the orthodoxy, which I think is a nice trick that she somehow managed to pull off. She also has, I think, 2 children, and is, currently enmeshed in the exploration of how to practice seriously within the context of family life. Deborah teaches often at IMS, the famous Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Massachusetts, where she was mentored by little-known but promising meditation teacher Joseph Goldstein, as well as Steve Armstrong. She also teaches at the Insight Meditation Community of Washington, D.C. On a personal note, I will just mention that Deborah was one of my retreat teachers when I did a month at the Forest Refuge, the Insight Meditation Society's Forest Refuge this past summer. That's why she's here, because I was just so blown away by her as a teacher. I found her interview advice so incredibly helpful, and her Dharma talks so profound, and I'm sure I'm making her a little uncomfortable right now, but that's how I feel. Sorry. Hey, Deborah.
Hi.
Is there anything you want to say before we get started? Well, first, you and I have a bit of a conversation, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. Anything you want to say before we get this show on the road?
Just to say hi to everybody. It's nice to see some familiar names and faces on the screen, and meet those of you who I haven't before. I do want to apologize in advance. The internet connection here is a little glitchy, so I may freeze up for a few seconds here and there, but it seems to always come back.
Okay. You're at the Forest Refuge right now, is that right?
Yeah.
Is this one of the walking rooms, or where are you? Or are you in your sort of quarters?
The IMS corporate housing.
Okay. I was trying to see if I could recognize the room, but I didn't quite, but I could almost imagine it being one of those little walking rooms. All right. Well, I'm so glad that you're here, Deborah. I'm so glad that you said yes to this. You really were a big part of my retreat and enormously helpful. And a lot of what I want to talk to you about is going to sort of draw from some of those conversations that we had. So I guess, I want to talk to you about Mahasi practice. So for people who don't know, you can maybe do a better job of this than I can, but I'll at least tee it up. For people who don't know, when I say Mahasi practice, it's sometimes called noting. There's a bunch of ways of referring to it, but it's referring to a style of meditation essentially refined and popularized by the famous Mahasi Sayadaw, the great 20th century Burmese Buddhist monk. And it involves a sort of careful attention to whatever is arising, I think, through the 6 sense doors is how Mahasi would have put it. And simply noticing, and sometimes using an inner word, a sort of silent word said within the mind, what's sometimes called a note, to help maintain this continuity of moment by moment awareness of whatever it is that's arising to one's experience. Is that a half decent capsule description of Mahasi practice, Deborah? Anything you want to add?
Yeah. When when I practiced in Burma, Sayadaw U Pandita was always impressing upon us that what we were actually practicing was Satipatthana Vipassana.
Indeed. Yeah.
So insight based on the 4 foundations of mindfulness.
Mm-hmm.
And specifically in the Mahasi-style comes out of this Burmese tradition that's heavily based in the Abhidhamma, the Buddhist psychology.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the noting, and that's one of the tools that's offered.
Mm-hmm.
But that's kind of a subset of what it's about. Really, it's about just moment-to-moment connection with what's called ultimate realities, things that are actually happening in our experience. So just, a very continuous, kind of careful way, tuning in more and more to what's really happening in the present moment.
Yeah. And I wonder if, you said it's Satipatthana practice, which is, the famous Satipatthana refers to the famous Buddhist text on the foundations of mindfulness, the Satipatthana Sutta. And it is in some ways almost a little reductive to just say anything coming in through the 6 sense doors, because that might not clue you in that you may also be noticing things like intentions arising in the mind. You may also notice things like the various meditative hindrances arising in the mind. Those aren't exactly sensory experiences, but they still fall within the purview of the 4 foundations of mindfulness, right? Hindrances, the pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral tone of things, intentions and urges, and so forth. So, yeah. And I want to zoom in on something you just said, which is that you're right. Mahasi practice is often considered to be interchangeable with the noting method, the using of silently uttered words inside the mind as an aid to mindfulness, continuous mindfulness. And so this is something that I've struggled with, because I have come to places in my practice where the noting came to feel more cumbersome than helpful. It felt like it was sort of holding me back in a way. But I felt hesitant to drop the noting because I felt like, well, that's the technique. And I have seen since then that in Mahasi's own writing, he has said at times, oh, there will be a point where you're not going to want to keep noting, so you should drop that. Can you speak to that a little bit? Because I think that's a real, that's like a sort of widely spread misapprehension about the practice, that you always got to be noting. So can you speak to the appropriateness of dropping that sort of inner labeling, and maybe how someone knows if it's appropriate to do so?
Yeah, I heard Sayadaw U Pandita talk about this multiple times with Westerners. I think he used to get kind of impatient with the Westerners because we tend to want to grab hold of that one tool and then tie ourselves into knots about it. Apparently, it's not as common with the Burmese students, but yeah, basically the point at which it starts to feel really cumbersome, like it's becoming a barrier between, the mind and the knowing of the experience, is the time to drop it. If it's not helpful, then we don't use it. That's really just a launching device. Like a lot of, so many different styles of meditation, they merge at the limit. They merge once that flow of mindfulness gets going and you're just in it. What differs is kind of the initial portion. Different teachers recommend different things for launching the practice, getting us into the flow. But then once we're in the flow, the practice is pretty much the same, no matter who you're studying with. So Goenka, for example, in that tradition, they teach body scanning, right? But it's the same thing. That's just a launching technique to get into the flow. Or you have Sayadaw U Tejaniya, who's a student of Mahasi Sayadaw, who teaches mindfulness of the mind. And, his launching technique is to pay attention to attitudes in the mind. So, there's many different ways to get into the flow, but the important thing is that we find some effective way to get into the flow, which is different for different ones of us and different at different times.
And so you would say that someone who follows U Tejaniya's method and someone who follows Mahasi's method and someone who follows Goenka's method or U Ba Khin's method, you feel that at a certain point in the practice, those really do become identical practices as the sort of outer trappings fall away or the mechanics fall away?
I do, because the Dharma is just the truth is the truth.
The thing that I struggled with letting go of the noting was it felt like a failure. It felt like I'm dropping the noting because I can't note fast enough. And there was like a part of me that was like, you should be able to, or it's quitting. You need to work. You need to practice until you're able to note as fast as these phenomena are moving, or at least get closer. Now, my sense is that's probably not the most wholesome attitude or motivation, but would you be so kind as to sort of validate me in that and speak to that for a second? I love validation from other people. It's one of my favorite things.
I'll give you a good Mahasi answer, which is, did you note all of that?
Mm. But then I could follow that up with saying, well, not fast enough.
Yeah, so then we'll talk about the not fast enough issue. The conceptual mind is very slow and clunky compared to the perceiving mind. So recognizing phenomena directly doesn't involve conceptualization. But that's one of the things that we come to see through the noting. That's another thing that the noting is good for, kind of revealing that there's a difference between the conceptualizing of experience and the direct experience of experience. So that's one of the things that become apparent at some point. And the truth is that the conceptualizing mind is slower, right? Like we know this just from neuroscience, right? The old brain picks up, back here at the base of the spine or whatever, picks up on experience much faster and quicker than the frontal cortex can make sense of it all, right, in words. So at a certain point, the noticing gets fast enough that the noting can't keep up, and we don't need it at that point. Like, it's impossible to keep up putting a word to everything at that point. It's going to get in the way. It's going to interfere. It's actually going to be a hindrance in practice. So then we just drop into the knowing. And, for those of us that have been on retreat or done a lot of practice, we're probably familiar with this space. We don't need the word. We're registering what's happening. We don't need to name it all. We're in direct contact with it. Mm-hmm. So that's the point at which we drop the noting. It's not a failure at all. That's actually the progress of practice, which is something that seems to have been lost in the translation of the Mahasi method. So
well, thank you. I appreciate that.
As I said multiple times, I saw Sayadaw tell people, okay, now you need to drop the noting.
It honestly wasn't lost. It's just, I think because I know I'm not the only person who feels that way, where they're really trying to note. And it's right there in black and white, in even the short text that Mahasi wrote, like his chapter 5 or his practical insight manual, where these are sort of the short things that people use as an on-ramp to doing that style of practice. It is right there. But he doesn't draw a ton of attention to it. He just says it matter-of-factly in like one sentence and moves on. And I don't think that's enough for a striver like me. It needs to have like a special box around it or something with like a little light bulb, like it would be in a book today, really drawing my attention to it. But I think, in working with you, I came to see the Mahasi practice as, in many ways, so much less harsh and so much less sort of stern or demanding than I had either been led to believe or led myself to believe. And it does have this reputation, doesn't it, as this sort of unforgiving, grueling practice. And I wonder if a lot of that comes from sort of the legend of U Pandita, right? As this, you hear so many stories about how stern he was. One of my teachers told me a story of, he said that he was in an interview with U Pandita, and U Pandita was looking through his practice journal. And he said, oh, there's a period of 5 minutes here where I don't see that you were practicing. What were you doing? And my teacher said, oh, Sayadaw, I was urinating. And then U Pandita said, okay, did you begin urinating on an in-breath or an out-breath? And when he couldn't answer him, U Pandita was just like, please try harder. Which I love as a story, but it does create this sort of myth of the practice as a very, grueling practice where you have to meet this incredibly high standard. And talking with you, and I think part of that manifests itself as this sense that it's very active. you're sort of looking for sensations, you're looking for phenomena to note. And, you helped clarify to me that it's in some ways more receptive than that. It's not going out trying to like whack-a-mole these various phenomena, that it's more allowing phenomena to arise and noticing them. Do I have that right? Is that a fair characterization? And could you talk a little bit about, that sense of Mahasi as this very active, very forceful practice, and maybe help us modulate that impression?
Different people have different minds. I mean, there's a few things. I was kind of in the second wave of Westerners that worked with Sayadaw U Pandita, and I think he did get better at working with us. Yeah. I think there's a certain amount of culture clash and meeting the East and West, at the beginning, and each side trying to kind of figure out where the other was coming from. It seems to be that first wave of folks that were going to U Pandita who got the really harsh teachings. But I mean, he expected total dedication, but total dedication doesn't have to be aggressive. It doesn't have to be violent. Total dedication can be very loving and very compassionate, which was mostly the side of him that I saw. He was very gentle with me. I didn't get that harshness. So yeah, I mean, apparently that very stern message worked for a lot of Burmese people. And it works for some Westerners too. Like I said, we all have different minds. So some of us, we need to hear, be diligent, be vigilant. We need to hear those messages of, heroic effort and courage. That really helps us to get to a place where we can engage the present moment fully. For others of us that have different conditioning, that will just get us all tied in knots. And we need to hear the message, settle back, relax, let experience come to you. Either way, it's the same thing happening. Again, it's just all about the language and what types of messages are most effective for most people. We'll meet them where they are in their practice. So that involves it's an exploration of, self-knowledge, right? Like what is the practice doing for us? Skillful effort is defined in terms of its effect, not in any ultimate term, So the question with effort is, am I practicing in such a way that the mind is becoming calmer and present? Am I practicing in such a way that the hindrances are receding and the awakening factors are growing? If we look at how we're going about it and that's not happening, then something needs to change.
Yeah. I love that. Did I hear you right that you said something like settle back and let experience or let phenomena come to you?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I love that. And I hear you that that's not necessarily the way that everyone needs to hear it, right? That's a formulation for certain minds. But I will say that for my mind, it's such a helpful correction to the way that I was tending to think about this style of Vipassana practice, of going out, hunt it. One way that I've been describing it to myself a little bit is that it's not hunting, it's fishing. You're sitting there, the sort of line of awareness is in the water, things bite, things don't bite, but you can't you're not going to reach in, or you certainly don't want to shake the fishing pole. That doesn't accomplish anything. But yeah, I think you said something like, at the Forest Refuge, you said something like, sit back and watch phenomena go by. And that sounds so peaceful. And I hadn't really realized that Mahasi-style practice could be so peaceful, but I found that it could, with the help of that sort of recalibrating instruction.
And when we find that sweet spot of skillful effort, again, whatever technique we're using, then it is very easeful. It's, when we find the right balance, the middle path with effort, then it should feel very sustainable. It shouldn't feel like a slog to get through the day. We just settle into that place. We're just meeting moment after moment. And it's very easy. It's very sustainable. We don't get exhausted by it.
Yeah. No, it's really a wonderful way to look at practice. And you see it more prevalently in certain traditions that really emphasize that. Like, I feel like I get that from Thai forest people more often. And certainly U Tejaniya's students, right? That's a real vibe. But it's great to understand that you don't have to, if you're doing this style of practice, you don't have to leave it in search of a gentler practice. You just have to understand the gentleness that's available within this practice and that sort of appropriate balanced effort that really any meditation practice should involve. So that's really helpful.
Well, it is true that some of us will jive more with one style than another.
For sure. Yeah.
It's possible for some of us to end up in the Thai forest tradition or practicing with U Tejaniya. And if we have the type of mind that's kind of naturally inclined to be a little vague, to be a little just kind of like, go with the flow, float along, we might not get, the messages that help us to like firm it up and sharpen it up and really connect in those traditions. It's really amazing that any of us ever really get anywhere. Depends on everything, all the stars aligning, that we like find the right path. Lo and behold, if we keep at it, we seem to.
But we are so lucky these days that it is all so laid out, right? In a way that it wasn't in the past. You really used to have to almost literally climb a mountain. You had to go to Dharamsala and meet Munindra or something to get these teachings in the 1970s, and now here we are on Zoom. But then there are pros and cons for sure to that.
It's the opposite issue now, right? Like there's so much on offer. Like where do we start and how do we?
Yes. Yeah. And I do hope that, I hope that getting talks like this on the web can be a clarifying resource for people. And on that note, I have a couple other things I want to talk to you about. But one thing is I do want to just flag, I always ask teachers when they join us for a talk like this, if they take students one-on-one. And we already had this conversation. So my understanding is that I successfully badgered you basically into saying that you would. You were sort of saying no, and then I sort of whined and made complaining noises, and now you do. So I'm sorry about that. But I'm not that sorry because I think it'll be very beneficial to a lot of people. So my understanding is that you have a monthly group interview, like a monthly sort of group conversation that you lead, and that if you know someone, not a total stranger, but if you know someone, and one way for you to come to know someone is for them to come to your monthly meet, you are open to potentially working with students one-on-one. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but do I have that right?
Yeah, you've got that right. Yeah.
Okay.
I really enjoy working with people one-on-one. I used to do it a lot before I had children, but just as I was telling you, the logistics of it are a little complicated now, but I'd like to get back to it some. Thank you for badgering me.
It was my pleasure. I think I'm the first person who signed up for your newly installed online scheduling system. So it was a purely selfish act. And I'm now reaping the rewards. So, but I'm very glad. And, and is it Dharma based? Is that how you're teaching?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Pure Dharma. Okay. That's lovely. So, I have two things I want to talk about, and then we will move to Q&A. The first, maybe three. I might be getting over it. We'll see. First, maybe briefly, we've been talking so much about Vipassana practice and particularly Mahasi practice. Could you talk a little bit about why someone would bother doing such a practice? What's the fruit? What's the benefit? Why do it?
Like Mahasi practice specifically?
I guess, or Vipassana practice or Buddhist practice generally. The answer is those are probably not super different answers, right? Well, I don't mean why would they choose Mahasi practice over something else? Why do insight practice? And there are certain forms of practice like concentration practice where it's like it brings a bunch of bliss, helps you do better at your job, whatever. You can get some groovy jhana states. but we're talking so much about insight practice, and I realize I'm sort of taking for granted that everyone's on the train, and maybe they're not, and they don't have to be, but they should. I at least want to get out there. What's up with insight practice? Why do we do it? What's it for? Is that something you think you could speak to a little bit without us, without needing to do a whole Dharma talk, which maybe that can only be addressed through like a full Dharma talk?
A really short answer, which is to be happy. We do it to be happy. We do it to be able to see and disentangle all of our hang-ups, all of our neuroses, all of the ways in which we're hard on ourselves and beat ourselves up, and, craving and aversion and delusion get in the way of us living skillful lives, and just to see more clearly what's going on here, and to be in more intimate contact with the whole experience of being alive. And there's so many benefits. The Buddha has this famous line that it's good in the beginning, it's good in the middle, and it's good in the end. The whole mindfulness-based stress reduction movement has demonstrated how it's good in the beginning. Even just an 8-week basic mindfulness course, people experience tremendous benefits in terms of inner self-talk, being able to see what's arising in mind, causing difficulties. And, the further we go with it, the more benefits are available, up to and including, it's a really deep understanding of what's going on here.
Yeah.
Is that satisfactory?
It is. I mean, technically nothing is, but that came pretty close, as far as conditioned phenomena go. So I'll take it. Thank you. And let's talk a little bit about being a Dharma practitioner and having kids. So I don't want to sort of give away the punchline, but I asked you about this when we had a conversation, just you and me. And I was like, you were a nun. You really seem to take seriously the idea of, the sort of Buddhist thesis about why we suffer and what we can do about it and what causes suffering, but then you embarked on this worldly life where you chose to have kids, Can you talk a little bit about why you chose that? And you basically said something like ignorance and craving, of course. And I was really struck by I couldn't believe you said that. Why do you have kids? Ignorance and craving. And then I said something about if there's an expectation that having children will make you happy or something like that. And you were immediately like, well, of course it won't. And that was so striking coming from, someone who I understand to be a very loving parent. And yet just looking square in the face and adopting this idea that, I had kids because of ignorance and craving, and having kids won't make you happy. So can you just elaborate on that? Because that is just wild.
I'm not sure what's so wild about it, but
okay, I'll elaborate on that briefly. I think that it is very hard to say anything but, I know you also said, I love the hell out of my kids. Obviously your children are very precious to you. But to say something like, well, they don't provide lasting happiness for me, I think is a thing that you'll rarely hear from a parent, right? There's a sort of cognitive dissonance involved in saying, yeah, I have these kids and they are not the end all be all in terms of my well-being and happiness. A lot of people would see that as almost a betrayal in a way, or just a thing that's very hard to say, and there's a lot of sort of people will talk about why it was so important for them to do it and why it was the right thing to do. And I didn't hear a word of that from you of well, ultimately it was right for me for this or that. Now you might believe that, that might be in there too, but you went straight to I was motivated by ignorance and craving. So just that frankness of not sort of covering the whole experience entirely in sort of glitter and pixie dust is unusual, I think, for a parent. And so I kind of want to hear can you talk about the apparent disparity, which I think is only apparent, between really, really loving your children and them being very dear to you, and still holding that hardline Buddhist view. They will not bring me happiness. I brought them into this world out of ignorance and craving.
One place that a lot of Western practitioners kind of run up against a wall, Elizabeth, that are lay people, is the whole romanticization of love in our culture, right? Whether it's family love or romantic love or, friendly love, whatever it might be, right? Love kind of gets a pass, as not being based in craving and ignorance, right? But if we look, that love that we feel for our partner, that love we feel for our kids, the love we feel for our friends, that it's a form of craving. I mean, let's call it what it is, So I think those of us that are on the path, if we're really committed to going deep, which, it's our choice if we want to go there or not. But if we're really committed on going deeper and deeper into the Dharma, there's a point at which we've got to recognize that these relationships that we have, which are basic human needs, they're things that we all need, just like food and sleep and shelter, that really they're based in craving and ignorance. That's just the truth of it. And but that's a stumbling block for a lot of people. We've got to be ready to open to that, But it's something that comes naturally through this clear seeing what's happening moment by moment. If we look into the heart in those even the most pleasant moments when we're interacting with someone, a being that we love, what's going on there? That's an investigation that it's worthwhile for all of us to make.
So let me ask this sort of hard and uncomfortable question. According to that, would you say that the ideal thing for a Buddhist practitioner, and I'm not saying this, and I'm not saying that you're saying this, but I'm asking, according to all that, would you argue that the ideal thing for a Buddhist practitioner, if they can do it, is to not have children, to not form other craving-rooted bonds of that kind? Would you go so far as to say that?
I would say the ideal thing for a serious Buddhist practitioner is to be aware in as many moments as possible, regardless of what your life circumstances are. There's not a need to make an excessive emphasis on the external circumstances. That's a misplaced emphasis.
Okay.
And what's going to be most supportive for different people? Again, different people have different minds. Like one of the reasons I decided to have kids is that I had a choice. I could either have kids out of craving or aversion, or I could not have kids I could have kids out of craving and delusion, or I could not have kids out of aversion and delusion. What was important was just to continue on my path, regardless of what decision I made. Like buying into that aversion message that, oh, I can't have kids because it's unspiritual, or it's going to hinder my growth. Like that is not any more noble than having them.
Mm.
Either way, I was stuck because that's the truth of our situation, right? Like, so we start off in practice before we come to practice. Mostly we don't have a clue about what's going on in the heart and the mind, right? Like that's at one end, the beginning end, and then at the other end there's full enlightenment. But most of our practice happens in the middle, in the uncomfortable area, where we have some clue what's going on in the heart and the mind, but we're still playing out our conditioning and our karma, right? Like I'm sure everyone here can relate to that. We see ourselves going down that path. We see the aversion, we see the craving, we see the confusion, and we're doing the best we can, but mostly that's what's driving us. So the practice then is just to keep watching, to hang in there with it. Keep paying attention. Over time, we'll learn the lessons that we need to learn, regardless of what the circumstances are. If we're committed, if we're, passionate about it.
Yeah. Yeah. I really appreciate you answering that, just sort of tackling that topic. It's so interesting. It's become a little bit of a theme. We had a previous guest, William Jackson, who was also a former monastic, now with 2 kids. And it's so interesting, and it provides such an interesting opportunity to explore these complicated intersections, right, of Dharma and life in this society. and lay life. And so I appreciate your going there. The last
here, like I feel like there are practice benefits in parenting. Like I feel there's a lot of rich practice in parenting, but I feel like it also would have been fine not to have kids, and there's lots of rich practice there. So I really feel like there's not a right answer, just like everything in life, right? There are different answers that unfold differently. Yeah.
And it might also depend on what sort of practice you need right at this point in your life. If what you really need is a ton of extended retreat, that ain't going to happen, right? If you have kids, not for a little more.
Ron Cords is doing a lot of intensive, practice, long-term retreats. Now's probably not the right time to have kids.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. Cool. So the last thing I want to talk to you about, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A. I just need to throw it out there because it was so valuable to me. It was just such a very wise thing you said to me on retreat. And I just wanted to throw it out there. Maybe it'll spark questions for the Q&A section. I'm not sure, but it was just such like an insight bomb that you dropped on me that I wanted to put it out there. So there was this point where I was talking about some impulse I had during an interview about some sort of striving or trying to meditate in this way or that way or progress faster through the stages or whatever. And you said, well, obviously that's just a bunch of craving, right? That's not helpful at all. And I responded by saying something like, totally, I'll really see if I can just relax about that and just sort of let that go and not worry about that so much. And your response was, well, you can't do that. You said that's not possible for you. This is your stuff right now. This is your conditioning. It's going to come up. What you can do is observe it as it comes up. And I thought that was such a subtle point. I thought I was doing the right thing by saying, okay, I'll just see if I can let that go. And the nuance of, well, you can't just let something go because you want to, if your mind's conditioning is to hold on to it, but you can watch that happening. And over time, if you're watching it, you're not feeding it, and your mind is learning that it's suffering, and change sort of happens as a result of that observation. That was sort of the sense I got of what you were saying. And I'm curious if you have any further thoughts on that point, but I really just wanted to get it out there because it was just an incredible teaching moment for me that has really, really reconfigured the way that I approach practice along a bunch of different axes. And it was a nuance that I needed and hadn't perceived. Is there anything you want to say about that, or did you say it all back then and I've recapitulated it, so we're good?
That's like a good Dharma teaching to me.
What'd you say?
I said, that sounds like a good Dharma teaching to me.
Yeah, if you do say so yourself, right?
I mean, there's so much in practice we prefer to skip over, right? We prefer, kind of the same thing we were just talking about with kids. Like, we'd like to skip over the part where we have to muddle through and observe all of our conditioning and let it work itself out in accordance with the Dharma, in accordance with the truth, in accordance with the laws of the heart and the mind. The truth being that we can't make it happen, right? Or else we would.
Yeah.
We have to work with the laws of nature, with the laws of the heart and the mind, which unfortunately doesn't usually involve just making a conscious choice to change something. So yeah, that's the hard part of the path. That's why we need patience and a whole lot of compassion, and a whole lot of love, and a whole lot of courage. All of the paramis, that cultivated over lifetimes. There's a reason why he needed to do that, because it takes a lot of that to wade through the places in practice where we're doing what we can, but we're really waiting.
Yeah.
To tangle themselves in their own sweet time.
But it's also very freeing too, because it means that a bunch of stuff that you thought was your job, it actually isn't your job. And right, that's a bunch of labor that you can a burden that you can set down if in time, as you get the hang, as that sort of comes to rest in you or comes to sort of land with you. But it does mean that a bunch of stuff that you thought you had to do is not actually your purview at all, which is kind of nice. It's kind of good news.
There's a lot of wisdom in that too, because it means that you're letting go of believing that you can do, that you actually have power, you have dominion over all of that conditioning. So,
well, I've monopolized your time long enough. Let's open it up to Q&A. Does that sound all right, Deborah? Okay. And we'll get started. So I see Frida has a question for you. Do you want to ask your question? Go ahead.
Okay. Hi, Deborah. So I just so people know, I don't consider that I had as much practice with the Sayadaws as you did, but I certainly had a lot of exposure to Sayadaw U Pandita and his generation of teachers and the ones under him. And so I need to focus on just one question. So, well, there's one and a half. So there was always this emphasis on the stages. He would talk about the stages. So, there's this stage and there's that stage and there's that stage. And if you get to if you get to the stage where you have the first realization of all the three conditions, that means you'll definitely come back as a human being in your next life. So that was like, okay, I think I got there, so I got that, which I don't know. So there's that. And then there's Mark Nunberg was doing a lot of using the teachings of Anileo and of the breathing. And so he was going through the different steps of the mindfulness of the breathing. And I was trying to figure out, is that the same as the stages that Mahasi uses? Because it sounded very similar. So that's two different questions, sort of, but I guess what it is, can you talk some more about the stages? And yeah, there was a lot of craving. There was definitely a lot of craving. But there was also a lot of practice. But yeah, whatever you want to do with all that.
Okay, yeah, there's a lot that could be said about that, obviously. So by stages, I assume you're meaning like the stages of the progress of insight.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is, those teachings are available in the West now. They weren't originally, right? Like when you start practicing, or even when I started practicing. But it's out there now. Translated in Mahasi's book and on the web, and people have access to those teachings on the stages of insight, which come out of the Siddhi Magga and out of the Abhidhamma, out of these old texts that are very analytical. And honestly, my feeling is that the less we know about that as Westerners, the better, to be honest. I mean, some of us are very academically oriented. For some of us, that will arouse faith, like kind of hearing that there's a predictable path to the unfolding of the Dharma, to the unfolding of awakening. For some people that can generate a lot of faith, but for a lot of people, it generates a lot of craving, like you're saying. So you got to get to this point, get to this point, and get to this point. It's actually much more supportive for practice if we just practice. Kind of like John was saying, we can't make it happen anyway, right? We might hear about from experience, not just in relation to the progress of insight, but just in general. Might hear about some meditative experience that somebody's had, or transformation that somebody said they've gone through, and feel like, oh, I really want that. I really want to get that. Right? But the only thing we can do to get that is just to keep paying attention to the present moment in front of us. So either way, the task is the same. And again, if hearing those teachings, or getting too caught up in those is getting us to a place where there's more hindrances rather than less, not helpful.
Thank you.
Thanks, Frida. And thanks, Deborah. Jeff, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. So my question is, I've been reading a lot more of the early suttas lately. And, I think, it puts a lot of emphasis on right concentration. and, talks a lot about like developing jhanas and, particularly doing jhanas before insight practice. But, at least as I've learned, the Mahasi method kind of seems like a more dry insight practice. And so could you just kind of talk a little bit about like, how should we be considering, levels of concentration? Like, should we be, just kind of stabilizing the mind, trying to go deeper before doing it? Like what kind of consideration should we?
Yeah, that's a big question, and one that a lot of people are thinking about these days. As the jhana practices also like become more available, both in terms of teachings and people who are teaching it, more people out there offering jhana practice now. Jhana being these deep states of concentration, for those who might not be familiar with it, that are practiced in a fairly formal and structured way to get the mind into particular states of absorption, which, as Jeff was saying, if you look in the early teachings, the Buddha talks about them constantly. They're part of what he did as his own path. And they can be really helpful at certain points in practice. But, Mahasi's innovation was that we don't necessarily need them for the purposes of insight. So in terms of arousing insight, being able to see impermanence, being able to see, emptiness, impersonality, dukkha, and satisfactoriness, in terms of being able to see those characteristics, what's actually important is the calming of the hindrances. So getting to a state which, like in jhana practice, is sometimes called access concentration, where the hindrances are quieted. We can actually really land in the present moment in a kind of continuous way. And we don't necessarily need to get all the way into jhana for that to happen. And again, it's kind of a question of different people have different minds. Some people don't concentrate so easily. We have different karma, we have different minds. Some people getting into jhana can become, again, a big exercise in tying ourselves in knots. Like it just doesn't come easily. It's a big slog. Ultimately not helpful. Other people, we go there relatively easy. It can be a great tool, can be a great practice at times for really strengthening the mind, strengthening a lot of supportive qualities. So, if you're inclined towards it and, you feel like it comes, it's moving along relatively easily, then go for it. From what I've seen, jhana practice can be good, especially at points where we feel like we're kind of stagnant in our practice. Like practicing for a while, we feel like we've kind of plateaued or hit a place where, we're not seeing new things, we're not going deeper. Then doing a short period or long period of jhana practice can help to kind of move along and ripen things. So, yeah, I think it does have a use, but from what I've seen, it's not strictly necessary for most people.
Thank you.
Can I address your question?
Awesome. Thank you, Jeff. Thanks, Deborah. So I have a question here sent for me to ask. So I will ask it. What is the most accessible nuts and bolts guide to the Mahasi method for those who can't go on a retreat?
That's a good question. Maybe to go online and listen to talks from retreats, right? Like, we've been teaching a Mahasi retreat at IMS every August for a number of years now. So you could go online and listen to the instructions from that retreat on dharmaseed.org. And like search for Mahasi. You can listen to Sayadaw U Pandita. His old talks on there too, I think, are still on there. Or even, they might even have some talks from Mahasi-style himself from his visit. I'm not sure if they do or not. Fred has got a suggestion there in the chat. Okay.
Yeah, Tathagata. So, Frida's suggesting Tathagata Meditation Center, which is a Burmese monastery in San Jose, California. But that's retreats, right? And this is someone wants a guide for those who can't go on retreat.
Stuff. They might have resources or talks also posted.
They do, actually. Yeah, they have some good stuff. There used to actually be a really great website called like Mahasi-Vipassana.com. And it was Oh, they post Frida's clarifying that they post a bunch of talks. Tathagata posts a bunch of talks, which is great. There used to be a website called Mahasi-Vipassana.com that had a bunch. It was someone had taken the time to collect and find online versions of like all the stuff from U Pandita, all the stuff from Mahasi, organized in a really sort of thoughtful way. It was great. I don't know what happened to that. It was just someone's pet project, obviously, and it's not on the web anymore as far as I can see. I wish I downloaded everything before it went away. Yeah. Oh, well, everything's impermanent.
One of the things about the Mahasi-style of practice is I do feel like it's a little hard to get it just from like written sources that are available, right?
Yeah.
Like you kind of need to have it interpreted a little bit through a Western teacher as a Westerner.
But you feel that listening to audio of a teacher on retreat could give that nuance that you're talking about?
I hope so, but it's still kind of an experiment and process.
I feel like with Mahasi practice, there's so many ways to misunderstand it that it's really helpful to be able to have a one-on-one with someone who can catch the particular way that you're misunderstanding it and correct you. Anyway, this isn't my Q&A. Let's see. All right, Frida, go ahead.
So with the noting, sometimes, especially a longer retreat, but even a 10-day retreat, the noting would like get to be its own. I called it the music, but it was like, it wasn't the same music. I could be in one place and it would be like very bouncy. In another place, it would be just clangy. But, and the noting seemed to go on even if like the mind wasn't really following what the body was doing, but there was just the noting. It was like, I don't know if it's the mind is noting or the noting is noting on its own. And I think I just kind of had to back away from all of it for a while because it was just too oppressive, I think, all the striving and the clanging and everything. And then, and just where my life was, but yeah. So now I feel like it's just a little bit too light, that there's not, I don't know how to find that in between. Yeah. I think there's part of me that's afraid of the noting because I don't want it to start clanging again.
Yeah. Yeah, when we really pick up that noting tool, it can really get in there and take hold, for doing it kind of the way it was traditionally taught by the Sayadaw, where it's like, literally every second or a couple of seconds all day long, that the mind just kind of, that becomes the conditioning of the mind, right? It latches up to that and it wants to keep doing that even if we don't necessarily want it to. Yeah. So then it may be more skillful to let it down, the mind and take. But you might see if you can bring it back now a little bit in a lighter way. That is a whole technique skill, learning how to bring in, just so that it points us to what's actually happening. A little pointer. Like, okay, there's the, the sensation of the breath, sensation of the body, taking the mind. Not to get so, fixated on the pointing, but what is it pointing to? And with a lighter touch. Yeah. Or, for some people, it's really not helpful. Some people just use it. Or some people do it more kinesthetically, like just directing the mind than actually using a verbal word. Or something can be more helpful.
Looking forward to seeing you in August, Deborah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Freda. Thank you, Deborah. Hey, Sean, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Yes, I was curious if you could say a little more about, like, you mentioned like the benefits of sometimes people like switch over to like jhana practice or some sort of like kind of deep concentration practice, and just kind of like where that leads. Because sometimes I practice like just going to more of like a concentration type of thing, and it feels like really kind good or it's just like interesting. But then there's another part of me that's like, oh, you should like be doing like noding or Vipassana or something because somehow it's more useful. But then there's another part of me that wonders if they all just like lead to the same place. Like if I do a lot of concentration stuff, they'll just go wherever the Vipassana practice goes. So yeah, I just wondering if you can say a little bit about that.
So are you saying that you feel like you kind of easily get into a concentrated state, or?
Yeah, or at least it's enough that it makes me intrigued or makes me want to like do more just to see like where it goes.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's another one of these cases of like, there's not one right answer and one wrong answer. If you feel drawn in that direction, check it out. Good.
Mhm.
It might be helpful to, I don't know if you have the ability to go and sit like a jhana retreat. If you have time in your life and you can carve out a chunk of time to go actually explore it a little more intentionally, then you can suss out how helpful it may or may not be, or just come to understand it a little more fully what it's about. And then you'll have a little more information to decide how much of your practice you might want to make it right now.
Cool. Thanks.
I feel like in general, Westerners, we need more concentration than we tend to think we need. But I say that with a caveat because then like some people get really like fixated on, developing like really intense degrees of concentration. So, but a lot of us, like we need definitely more concentration, even if we're just doing pure insight practice, we need more concentration than just a kind of a garden variety everyday level of concentration. So in some way we need to be building concentration, whether or not that needs to necessarily be jhana or not, kind of depends. But building concentration is part of one of the spokes of the Eightfold Path, right? Just build concentration.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Deborah. I have a question that was sent to me to ask. And the question is, curious what you think about teaching small kids, e.g., what might perhaps help them see through their selves someday.
It's funny because I have kids. People often think that I ought to be good at teaching meditation to kids. I'm not really. I don't really teach meditation to children. There are people who are really good at that. But I don't know. Both of my kids have been introduced to mindfulness at school, right? Because it's so prevalent these days. Like both of my kids have a basic grasp of, kind of simple mindfulness just from things that they do at school. We can't dictate their path in life. We can introduce them to it, but we can't to make them decide to take it up or take a particular direction. That has to be for them. I feel like what's most useful is really to model it for kids. It is great to give them like simple mindfulness tools. That's been shown to be really helpful, like even for kids and also especially for teens. These days can really get a lot of mindfulness tools. But just to show them by our own example that we're dedicated to practice and to model honesty, compassion, to model those qualities that are going to be helpful to them on their way. And then they can judge for themselves how far they want to take it at what point. The Buddha did used to say that there were the 7-year-old could become an arhat and master their practices. But I think probably they need to be a little bit older inside if they really want to delve into that territory of insight or not. The fundamental practices we seal up. I feel like that's the most important thing to impart to our children is the idea of acting compassionately, acting consciously, cultivating loving kindness. A lot of these supportive qualities, if they can get established in those early in life, then it'll make it that much easier for them, whichever way they decide to go when they get older.
Thanks, Deborah. Okay, another question given to me to ask. Please ask, what is the most important practice for a beginning meditator to do who cannot attend retreat at this time?
Just mindfulness. It's sitting meditation. I always recommend Bhante Gunaratana's Mindfulness in Plain English to, like, really beginners just starting out. It's a great practical guide just for, how to sit down, start paying attention. You can use the breath, the body as a place to start cultivating mindfulness. And local, if you can attend, I guess these days it's mostly online, but if you can find a group like this to come and sit with and be with other people that are doing it, then that's a good place to start.
And you already have. You have found such a group.
Thanks.
Here it is. Your prayers are answered. Cool. Thank you, Deborah. And then we have another question for me to ask. Can you ask for me? The question is there a healthy way to have children, like an appropriate state of mind or intention to come to that choice with?
Also not a parenting expert, but I think that, the skillful intentions that are laid out in the Eightfold Path also apply to parenting. So that's the intention of kindness, of compassion, and of renunciation. Those are all good qualities to bring to parenting. If we think we can approach it really, at least with the intention to offer unconditional love. A lot of the time it would be very conditional, but at least with the intention to offer unconditional love and to continue exploring what that really means, to continue learning about what that means and learning to manifest it more and more. That's one of the great teachings of parenting. And to cultivate an attitude of compassion towards our children, recognizing that they are going to suffer and that we can't assure their happiness and they have their own karma and their own past to live out in life, and to really hold them with a lot of compassion for whatever their trajectory may be in the world. And then renunciation. Parenting is a huge practice of renunciation, So having that commitment going into it, that this is about setting aside our own preferences and likes, in favor of someone else's well-being. Not that we need to just become total martyrs of parents, but that it is a huge practice in attending someone else's needs and setting aside our own. So those three wholesome intentions that the Buddha laid out in the Eightfold Path, I think really also apply to parenting. If we can be, if we can get to a heart space where we feel like that is doable, that we can cultivate those practices, then chances are it'll be okay.
Thank you, Deborah. Finally, someone else other than me. Jennifer, do you want to ask your question?
I shall try. It's about the noting practice, and when I talk about it, I'm not so much naming as feeling, but recognizing the feelings. And if I understood you correctly, you said something about once the hindrances are relatively at bay, then you can kind of just relax down and go into knowing. And context, I'm reading Bhikkhu Analaya's book on Satipatthana, and he goes on to, after the hindrances, he covers the awakening factors. And I'd never seen the awakening factors approached so actively. First he names them and feels, and then he talks about balancing them. There's too much of this, you do this, and which is a very active practice. And I'm thinking about, when you let go and rest, and when you kind of get all busy again, there's a little too much of this joy here. I think I'm going to work on some serenity. How does this fit into Sayadaw U Pandita's practice, or is it just totally different?
Yeah, I mean, it's not totally different, kind of like we were talking about before. It's different launching pads, right? So for some people, having a more active practice like that helps the mind to really engage and connect. So again, the proof is in the pudding. You have to see what works for you. That kind of more active exploration can be helpful, can be very helpful, but it doesn't have to look like that. As long as we're just knowing something in the present moment is actually true, then the practice will progress. So there's lots of different tools that we can use to help us connect with something that's true in the present moment. Whichever ones work, it's all good. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks, Deborah. Another question for me to ask. Can Deborah say more about concentration and how to develop it more within this tradition? More specifically, the relationship or challenges between building concentration and awareness while practicing. Thank you.
Well, this is one of the reasons why there's the emphasis at the beginning in Mahasi-style practice on anchoring in the breath and the noting. So those are both techniques that build concentration, and that's a large part of the argument for starting off that way. By just coming back to the breath, and by having that regular noting, naming experience that keeps us coming back to the present experience. So that in itself builds concentration. Mahasi-style talked about, rather than jhanic concentration in Vipassana practice, having a momentary concentration, which is kind of an interesting concept. I was really intrigued when I first heard about this. So rather than focusing just on one experience, like, the breath or an image, a kasina, a meditation object of some kind, and getting concentrated on that. In a way, it's like what we're concentrating on in Vipassana practice and insight practice is the present moment itself. That's what we're concentrating on. We're concentrating on this moment and getting the mind really trained on present moment. So then the actual content of the present moment doesn't really matter, because what we're concentrating on is the present moment, and then whatever's there is there. So it's a little bit of a different understanding of concentration. But just in practice, working with, hundreds, thousands of yogis, it does seem to actually really work. So, there's a lot of kind of theoretical debates that go on about, well, do you need jhana? Do you just need access concentration? Does it not really matter? It's a little bit academic, because just teaching, we've got a few decades of teaching this way at IMS, and it seems to work. So we can have some confidence in that.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I'll just ask a quick follow-up about that. They say they talk in the suttas, and Mahasi talks about, and people in the Mahasi tradition talk about the 5 controlling faculties, or the 5 spiritual faculties, or the 5 spiritual powers. And one of them is concentration, samadhi, and another one is mindfulness, sati. What I've never quite understood, and none of my teachers have been able to explain it to me to my satisfaction, which may be more my problem than theirs, but is in the context of Mahasi practice, where you are not anchoring your attention on any particular thing. And after a certain point, even the breath as a focal point, you sort of let go of, and you really are allowing whatever is arising to arise. And the moment is your object, as you said. What does concentration refer to? And in what way is it different from what mindfulness refers to? Because they both seem to sort of refer to a kind of undistracted awareness of what's happening now, rather than being lost in either distraction or dullness or something. But, when we're talking about concentration practice or samatha, very clear to understand what the difference is between those two. Concentration means, are you with the object or not? But where the object simply is the present moment, and mindfulness is defined so often by people as some sort of present moment awareness, what is the difference between those two faculties in the Mahasi context?
I mean, it's really the same, I think. I mean, concentration is totally different from mindfulness. Concentration is just that ability to filter experience, right? It's always active. Concentration is present in every moment of experience because as human beings, we're incapable of being aware of every single sensory stimulus that is coming in a given moment, right? Our nervous system just automatically filters it. And then that can be, stronger, weaker, strength at that, weaker, concentration. Whereas mindfulness is actually the remembering, but technically, the constant remembering to come back, remembering to stay connected. And then awareness is something else. But so it's the remembering to stay connecting and then the filtering out of all the distractions. The difference between it was getting kind of academic. Look at the difference.
No, but it's important for practice because I get, I've had teachers say something like, "Oh yeah, you need more samadhi," but in the context of Mahasi practice, it's like, well, what do you mean? And how is that different? How is that different from having more mindfulness? Because it seems like in Mahasi practice, all you have to do is remember to be present. There's no further. You're not filtering anything out, right? So.
There's there is this concentration of the present moment, right? Like we can think of the alternative to that very clearly, right? The mind keeps drifting off, drifting there, getting distracted, right? So you might think of it as undistractability.
Yeah. Okay.
The ability to stay connected moment to moment, stay present. The mind is concentrated on the present moment.
And that's distinct from mindfulness, which is the noticing of whether that is or isn't the case.
Yeah. We've all had experiences of being really concentrated and not aware at all, right? Like we get into the zone with doing something, if we're playing a game or, if we can get really concentrated on our phone, really and there's been no awareness whatsoever, right? Or there can be a very global awareness, like a general kind of mindfulness, a general kind of awareness, but without really much focus on a really close attention.
Okay. I think I see something there. And
I don't know that any of that is so helpful to really dwell on.
It might not be. It's just that it's something that's been brought up in interviews, and it's like, well, talking about like sort of calibrating your samadhi versus your sati in Mahasi practice. It seems like you're saying maybe don't worry so much about this versus that. Like if you know how to do the practice and be present and notice if you're not present, then you got it. Don't worry about what's this and what's that.
Well, it is true that we can get out of balance, right? So like we can get an excess of tranquility compared to awareness, and we get a sinking mind, right? But we can get an excess of kind of vigilant awareness without enough tranquility, and then we get restless, right? So that maybe that's the context in which it might be helpful, is if we're out of kilter, we're out of balance.
Yeah, I definitely hear about the balance of concentration and energy, and that makes a lot of sense in terms of like the tuning of the mind, right? How active versus how quiescent, and finding that balance.
Yeah, that can be helpful to know how to navigate, kind of ups and downs.
Yeah. All right, Deborah. Well, we're basically at the perfect time to wrap up. So, everyone who wanted to ask questions, got to, which makes me very happy. I'm going to post once more in the chat how to offer Dana to Deborah, also her website. Check it out. That is where you can schedule one-on-one meetings, but do not bother unless you have connected with Deborah in some other way. Can they find your monthly meetup information about that on your website, Deborah?
Yeah, I'd love to see any of you guys there that want to drop in and chat some more.
You'll see me there at some point, unless it's on Thursdays at 7 p.m. Eastern time. It isn't, is it?
It's Wednesday nights, last Wednesday of the month.
All right, then. So you'll see me there at some point. I think it's so cool that Deborah does all her teaching purely on a Dana basis. She does not charge. So if you want to support the offering of these wonderful teachings and the work of this wonderful teacher, please consider offering dana. Deborah, any final things you want to say before we wrap?
Just thank you for having me. This has been delightful, and I hope this group really flourishes. It seems like a great venue, a great support for people who are really interested in practice.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you so much for coming and hanging out with us. It really meant a lot to me. I was so happy you were able to do it. And with that, I want to thank all of you for your time, for your attention, for your practice. Please come hang out with us again sometime. Thanks, everybody. Good night.